The stallion goes down in the mud before the gavel even falls, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in that auction ring moves. His legs buckle first, then his shoulder, then his head, and the sound he makes hitting the ground is not the sound of an animal falling. It is the sound of something giving up. Steam rises off his ribs into the cold morning air. Somewhere behind the rail, a woman in a faded barn coat is already climbing over the fence before anyone can stop her, before anyone even understands why. What she finds on his shoulder the next morning, buried under 8 years of scar tissue and dried mud, is going to unravel a lie that has held an entire town together since the day her husband died. Before we get there, subscribe and drop a comment with the name of your city. This story is about a woman named Lorelei, a horse nobody wanted, and a secret buried in a piece of metal seared into skin. Stay until the end, because what she finds inside that horse changes everything anyone in Cedar Ridge thought they knew about her family. Now let's go back to that morning in the mud. The fog over Cedar Ridge County does not lift so much as retreat, pulling back in slow gray sheets from the hills, revealing the auction grounds one fence post at a time. It is late October, and the cold has teeth in it, the kind that finds its way through denim and settles into the joints of anyone standing still for too long. Trucks line the gravel lot in crooked rows, engines ticking as they cool, exhaust curling up to join the fog. A hand-painted sign nailed to a fence post reads Cedar Ridge Livestock Auction. Cash only. The paint chipped at the corners from years of weather nobody bothered to protect it from. This is not the auction it used to be. 10 years ago, buyers came from 3 counties over. Trucks and trailers backed up along the county road. Men in press shirts bidding on registered stock with real money behind their signatures. Now the crowd is thinner, quieter, made up mostly of men looking for cheap labor on 4 legs and men looking to turn a quick profit, sending broken animals to slaughter buyers who ask no questions. The horses that come through here now are the ones nobody else wants. The old ones. The lame ones. The ones somebody gave up on. Lorelei Hendricks stands near the back of the crowd with her collar turned up and her hands buried in her coat pockets. Not because she wants to be there, but because the diesel bill on her truck is 3 weeks overdue and there is a mare in her back pasture that needs a farrier before winter sets its teeth in. She is 52 years old, and the lines on her face are not the lines of a woman who has aged gracefully so much as a woman who has aged underweight. She does not speak to anyone. Nobody speaks to her either. Not really. Not since Wendell died 4 years ago, and the whispering started about how the Hendricks Ranch had gone to seed under her watch, about how a woman alone can't run 400 acres, about how maybe if she'd been paying attention that afternoon in the North Pasture instead of wherever she was, her husband might still be breathing. She has heard every version of that sentence. She has never once corrected any of them, because correcting it would mean saying it out loud. And there are some things a person carries in silence because silence is the only container strong enough to hold them. The auctioneer's voice crackles through a PA system that has seen better decades, calling lot numbers, moving cattle through first, then a pen of aging quarter horses, then a scattering of mules nobody bids on past the opening number. The crowd thins as the morning wears on, cigarette smoke and coffee steam mixing with the smell of manure and wet hay. Lorelei checks her watch. She has told herself she will leave after the cattle, that she has no business here, that whatever farrier money she scrapes together needs to stay in her pocket and not get thrown at some sentimental impulse she can't afford. Then Lot 41 comes through the gate, and the entire tone of the morning changes. He does not walk into the ring so much as get pushed into it, a rope looped rough around his neck, handled by a man who clearly has no interest in what happens to him after the sale. He is a dapple gray gone almost white with age, a saddlebred by the look of what remains of his conformation, though it takes a trained eye to see it under the wreckage. His ribs show through a coat gone dull and patchy. His hooves are cracked and overgrown, the kind of neglect that takes years to accumulate. There is a rawness at his hip where a saddle or a harness sat too long without care. His head hangs low, ears pinned back not in aggression, but in something closer to surrender. A murmur runs through what's left of the crowd. Someone near the front laughs, low and ugly, the kind of laugh men make when they've already decided an animal is worth nothing but the price of its hide. The auctioneer barely finishes his opening number before the horse's front legs fold. He goes down hard, first to his knees, then his whole body following, collapsing sideways into the churned mud of the ring with a sound that silences even the auctioneer mid-sentence. Dust and moisture kick up around him. His sides heave. His head stays down, and for a moment nobody moves, because a horse going down in an auction ring usually means only one thing, and everyone there has seen that ending before. Lorelei is already moving before she decides to move. She does not remember climbing the rail. She remembers the cold bite of the top board under her palm, and then the give of mud under her boots, and then she is kneeling in it, in the filth and the stink, her hand flat against the stallion's neck, feeling the pulse hammering too fast beneath the skin. Up close, the damage is worse. His eyes are half-lidded, glassy, rimmed with crust. His breath comes ragged, shallow, each exhale trembling through his ribs like something is caught there and won't come loose. Someone behind her is shouting for her to get clear, that the animal is going down for the kill truck anyway, that this isn't her business. She does not turn around. She keeps her hand where it is, murmuring something too low for anyone else to hear, the kind of sound a person makes to a creature that has stopped believing anyone will speak to it kindly again. The auctioneer, flustered, calls for the sale to continue as is, animal down or not, because the paperwork doesn't care whether the horse can stand. Bids start low and cruel, the kind of numbers meant for a carcass rather than a life. Lorelei raises her hand on the second call, and the number that comes out of her mouth surprises even her. A number that empties the last of the emergency fund she has been protecting since the bank started sending its letters. The fund she swore she would not touch no matter how bad the winter got. Nobody bids against her. Nobody wants what's lying in that mud badly enough to spend real money on it. The gavel comes down. The horse is hers. She does not feel triumphant. She feels the cold seeping through her knees, feels the weight of every eye in that thinning crowd on the back of her neck, feels the particular flavor of judgment reserved for a woman already rumored to be drowning in debt, now paying good money for an animal that might not survive the trailer ride home. Near the fence, a man in a wool coat far too clean for a livestock auction watches with his arms folded and something unreadable behind his eyes. Lawson Whitfield does not bid on horses. He has not needed to bid on anything in this county for a long time, not since he started buying up notes and mortgages the way other men collect stamps. He watches Lorelei kneel in the mud beside a dying horse, and something in his expression shifts, subtle, calculating, the look of a man recalculating a plan that was already in motion before the gavel fell. A younger man crouches at the rail with a battered vet bag already open beside him, watching the stallions breathing with the focused stillness of someone whose hands are faster than his doubts. Kalen Reyes has been the county's contract veterinarian for 8 months, hired cheap by a town council that wanted the appearance of oversight without the cost of paying for it properly. He has learned already which auctions to dread. He has never seen one end quite like this. Nobody in that ring knows yet what is seared into the stallion's shoulder beneath 8 years of scar tissue and mud. Nobody knows that by tomorrow morning, the ground under all of them is going to shift. The trailer ride home takes 40 minutes, and Lorelei spends every one of them with the divider open, one hand braced against the stallion's neck to keep him from going down again on the turns. He does not fight her. He does not fight anything. That, more than the ribs or the cracked hooves, is what unsettles her most, the complete absence of resistance in an animal built for it. Her ranch sits at the end of a gravel drive that hasn't seen fresh rock in 3 years. The house behind it a 2-story farmhouse that Wendell's grandfather built with lumber hauled up from the valley sawmill. Now missing shingles on the north side, and carrying a slight lean nobody has had the money or the heart to correct. The barn, at least, still stands solid. Wendell built that with his own hands the summer after they married. And whatever else has fallen into disrepair around this place, she has kept that barn tight against the weather, because some things a person protects out of grief rather than practicality. She backs the trailer up to the barn door and drops the ramp slow. The stallion does not want to move. She stands at his shoulder for a long moment, not pulling, not pushing, just present, until something in the stillness convinces him the ground outside is safe enough to try. He comes down the ramp on legs that shake with the effort, and by the time he reaches the stall she is bedded deep with straw. His sides are heaving again, sweat darkening what little coat remains on his neck. She does not sleep that night. She sits on an overturned bucket outside his stall with a thermos of black coffee going cold in her hands, watching him through the bars, listening to the rasp of his breathing even out by degrees as the hours pass. Around 2 in the morning, he lies down, folding slow and careful like every joint costs him something, and she watches his ribs rise and fall until the rhythm steadies into something that might, with enough patience, become sleep. There is a photograph on the wall of the tack room that she has not looked at directly in longer than she can admit. Wendell, 30 years younger, standing beside a bay gelding at a county fair, grinning the way he grinned before the mortgage payments and the bad years and the particular exhaustion that settles into a marriage carrying too much weight for too long. Beside that photograph, smaller, water-stained, is one of her father, a man named Silas Whitlock, standing in front of a barn that no longer exists, his hand resting on the neck of a gray stallion whose name she has not spoken aloud in 8 years. She does not let herself look at that second photograph tonight. She tells herself it means nothing, that gray stallions are not uncommon, that grief has a way of making a person see ghosts in coincidence. She does not entirely believe herself. By dawn, the animal in the stall is breathing easier, and something in his half-lidded eyes has shifted from surrender towards something closer to attention. He watches her when she brings the bucket of warm mash to the door. He does not flinch from her hand the way he flinched from the man who dragged him into the auction ring. Whatever damage was done to him, it seems, was not always the shape it is now. She kneels by the stall door and studies him properly for the first time in full light, and that is when she notices it, a patch on his left shoulder where the hair has never grown back right, a raised welt of old scar tissue mostly hidden under mud and neglect, a brand, or what's left of one, warped by years of poor healing and worse care. She reaches for the rag hanging on the stall door and dips it in the water bucket and begins, carefully, to clean the caked filth away from that one patch of hide. The shape underneath makes her hand go still. It is not a shape she recognizes right away, not through the dirt, not through 8 years of distance from anything that might have reminded her. But something about the curve of it, the particular angle where 2 lines cross, tugs at a memory she has spent a long time trying not to visit. She does not finish cleaning it that morning. She tells herself she needs the vet to look at his hooves first, that the brand can wait, that there is nothing to be gained from chasing a resemblance that grief is probably inventing out of nothing. She goes inside, makes coffee she does not drink, and does not sleep again. Kalen Reyes arrives a little after 9, his truck rattling up the gravel drive with a trailer hitch that has seen better decades and a magnetic sign on the door reading Cedar Ridge Mobile Veterinary, the letters faded from sun. He is younger than Lorelei expected when she called the county line the night before, younger and more careful in his movements than most of the men who come through this county pretending confidence they don't have. He crouches by the stallion's front hooves for a long time before he says anything at all, running his thumb along a crack that runs nearly to the coronary band, testing the give of the soul with a pressure gauge that makes the horse's ears flick but does not make him pull away. Rough handling for a long time, he says finally, standing, wiping his hands on a rag. Malnourishment. Dehydration that's been going on for weeks, not days. Whoever had him before the auction wasn't feeding him to sell him. They were feeding him just enough to keep him standing for the walk into the ring. Lorelei says nothing. She has learned that silence draws out more information than questions do, that people fill quiet with things they might not offer if asked directly. He's older than he looks under all this, Kalen adds, running a hand down the horse's neck, checking his teeth with the ease of someone who has done this 1,000 times. Late teens, maybe 20. Good bone structure under the damage. Somebody bred this horse to be something, once. He glances toward her, and something in his expression shifts from professional to curious. You got a name for him yet? He asks. She looks at the animal for a long moment before she answers. Sombra, she says. It means shadow. Kalen doesn't ask why. He nods, the way a person nods when they sense a story behind a word but understand it isn't theirs to pull it yet, and goes back to his examination, moving down the horse's shoulder, and that is when his hand pauses over the same patch of hide Lorelei cleaned that morning. What's this? He asks, crouching lower, studying the raised scar tissue with the particular attention of someone whose training has just been triggered by something out of the ordinary. Lorelei kneels beside him. In full daylight, with the mud mostly cleared away, the shape is clearer than it was at dawn, though still obscured by scarring and years of poor healing. A registered brand. The kind ranches used before microchips became standard, the kind that meant something once. back when bloodlines were tracked by hot iron instead of digital record. I don't know, she says, which is not entirely a lie and not entirely the truth either. Kaylin traces the outline with 2 fingers, careful not to press too hard against skin that has clearly not forgiven whatever caused it. Whoever did this tried to alter it afterward, he says. See how the lines don't connect clean? Somebody went over part of this brand with a second iron, tried to change the shape. Badly, from the look of the scarring. Whoever did it wasn't a professional. Something in Lorelai's chest goes tight and cold at once, a sensation she recognizes from exactly one other moment in her life. The moment a sheriff's deputy stood on her porch 4 years ago with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that told her everything before he said a single word. Can you tell what it used to be? She asks, and her voice comes out steadier than she feels. Kaylin studies it another long moment, tilting his head, tracing the warped lines with his eyes rather than his fingers now. Not for certain, he says. Not without cleaning it properly, and maybe getting a photograph under raking light. But there's a shape here, a curve and a crossbar, that looks like it could have been a W once, before somebody tried to make it into something else. The barn goes very quiet. Somewhere outside, a truck passes on the county road, its engine fading into the distance, and neither of them speaks for a long moment. You look like you've seen a ghost, Kaylin says. Lorelai stands slowly, brushing straw from her knees, and does not answer him directly. Finish the exam, she says instead. Tell me what he needs to get well. That's what matters this morning. But her eyes go back to the brand twice more before Kaylin finishes packing his bag, and something in the way she looks at it now is different from the way she looked at it at dawn. Less like a woman noticing a coincidence. More like a woman standing at the edge of a memory she has spent 8 years trying to convince herself never happened. By the time Kaylin's truck pulls back down the gravel drive, another vehicle is already turning in behind it, a black pickup with a bank logo on the door that Lorelai knows before she can even see the driver's face. Lawson Whitfield does not knock. He never has. Not since Wendell died and the courtesy of asking permission stopped applying to a widow 4 payments behind on notes he now personally holds. He climbs out of the truck slow, unhurried, the way a man moves when he already believes he owns whatever ground he's standing on. Heard you made an interesting purchase yesterday, he says, glancing toward the barn. Lorelai does not invite him closer. Heard wrong then, she says. I bought a horse at an auction. Nothing interesting about that. Lawson's eyes drift past her, toward the barn door, toward the shape of the gray stallion visible in the gloom beyond it, and something in his expression sharpens in a way that makes the morning feel suddenly colder than the temperature accounts for. That depends entirely, he says, on which horse it turns out to be. Lawson does not move toward the barn. He stands at the edge of the gravel where the drive meets the yard, hands in his coat pockets, studying the structure the way a man studies a piece of land he intends to survey rather than a place he has any right to walk into. Lorelai has seen that look on him before, at the bank, across a desk stacked with paperwork bearing her husband's signature and increasingly, over the last 4 years, her own. I'm not sure what you think you heard, she says, but nothing about that horse concerns you. Lawson's mouth curves into something that isn't quite a smile. That's not entirely accurate, Lorelai, he says. He's careful with her name, using it the way a man uses a tool, deliberate, calculated to remind her of a familiarity neither of them actually shares anymore. Your account with the bank carries an outstanding balance secured against the assets of this property. Any livestock purchased using funds that should rightfully be servicing that debt becomes a point of interest for us. I paid for that horse with my own money, she says. Money that isn't the bank's business. Everything on this ranch is the bank's business, Lorelai, he says, and for the first time something harder shows through the practiced civility in his voice. That's what happens when a note goes unpaid for as long as yours has. She does not answer right away. Behind her, in the barn, she can hear the soft shift of straw as the stallion moves, restless, perhaps sensing the tension carried on voices he cannot understand but can clearly feel. You gave Wendell 4 years to catch up on those payments while you sat across the table telling him it was fine, telling him you were partners, she says finally, and her voice does not rise, does not shake, carries instead the flat weight of something she has held in for a very long time. And the day he died, you stopped being patient. Funny how that works. Lawson's jaw tightens, almost imperceptibly. Business is business, he says. Grief doesn't renegotiate a mortgage. No, Lorelei says. But it apparently renegotiates a man's memory of what kind of partner he was. For a moment, neither of them says anything. The fog that clung to the fields that morning has burned off entirely now, leaving the yard in flat gray light, the kind that makes everything look a little more exposed than it should. Lawson glances once more toward the barn, and something calculating passes behind his eyes before he speaks again. I'll be honest with you, he says, because I think honesty is the kindest thing I can offer at this point. That horse, if it is who I think it might be, was never legally the property of the seller who put it up for auction, which means your purchase, however well-intentioned, may not hold up. And if that animal turns out to be tied to unresolved debts from this property's history, the bank has every right to reclaim it as collateral. I don't know what you're talking about, Lorelei says, and this time the lie costs her something to say, because some part of her, standing in the cold morning light with her father's ghost pressing at the edges of her memory, suspects exactly what he's talking about. Then you have nothing to worry about, Lawson says, his voice smooth again, all the hard edges tucked back beneath practiced warmth. But I'd advise you to have your paperwork in order. And I'd advise you, as someone who has always wished you well despite how things have gone, to think carefully about what you're willing to lose over an animal that isn't worth what you paid for him. He turns back toward his truck without waiting for a response, the gravel crunching under his boots in a rhythm too unhurried for a man who has just made a threat, and it is only after his taillights disappear down the drive that Lorelei lets herself exhale the breath she has been holding since he first said the word interesting. She goes back into the barn. Sombra stands at the front of his stall, ears pricked toward the door, watching her the way he watched her in the auction ring, some flicker of alertness in his eyes that wasn't there yesterday. She approaches slowly, lets him lower his head to her hand before she touches him, and runs her palm along the ridge of scar tissue on his shoulder, over the shape that Kalen said might once have been a letter, a curve and a crossbar warped by a second iron applied badly, applied in a hurry, applied by someone who wanted a truth erased and did not know how to erase it properly. Who did this to you? She says, quiet, more to herself than to the horse. And for the first time in 8 years, she allows herself to think, fully and without flinching away from it, of her father's barn and the night the last of his herd disappeared, and the gray colt that was never found among the animals recovered afterward, the one the insurance company eventually wrote off as lost to theft, the one whose absence broke something in her father that never fully mended before he died 2 years later. She does not have proof yet. She has a scar and a suspicion and a banker suddenly very interested in an animal he claims is worth nothing. That, she thinks, standing in the cold barn with her hand resting on 8-year-old scar tissue, is itself a kind of proof. The days that follow settle into a rhythm built around the stallion's slow recovery, though calling it a rhythm undersells how much of Lorelei's attention it consumes. She rises before dawn to mix the special feed Kalen prescribed, small portions spaced through the day to avoid shocking a digestive system starved for too long. She soaks his cracked hooves in warm water and Epsom salt, wraps them after, watches for the particular tremor in his legs that tells her when he's pushed himself too far and needs rest rather than encouragement. She sits with him in the evenings on the same overturned bucket, watching him eat, watching the hollows in his flanks fill in by degrees too small to notice day to day, but undeniable week to week. Word travels through Cedar Ridge the way it always does, faster than truth and less accurate with every retelling. By the second week, the version circulating at the diner on Main Street has Lorelei spending money she doesn't have on a horse that's going to die anyway, throwing good money after bad the same way. People say she let the whole ranch slide after Wendell passed. She hears fragments of it secondhand from the 1 or 2 people in town who still speak to her plainly, and she does not correct any of it, because correcting rumor takes more energy than she has left over after a day spent nursing a half-dead stallion back from the edge of nothing. Kalen comes back twice that week, officially to check the stallion's progress, though Lorelei notices he lingers longer than strictly necessary, asking questions about the ranch's history that have nothing to do with veterinary care. He is careful about it, circling the subject rather than approaching directly, but she recognizes the pattern of a man who has started noticing things he isn't sure he's allowed to ask about outright. You grew up on a horse ranch, he says one afternoon, not quite a question, watching her check the wrap on Sombra's near hind. My father bred saddlebreds, she says. Registered stock. Good bloodlines. He had a name in this county once, before it all fell apart. What happened? Kaylin asks. Lorelei straightens, presses a hand briefly against her lower back where the crouching has started to ache. Theft, she says. Most of his herd disappeared one night, 8 years before Wendell died. Insurance covered part of it, not enough to save the operation. He never recovered the animals. Never recovered much of anything after that, if I'm honest. He passed 2 years later. The land got sold off in pieces to cover what was left of the debt. Kaylin is quiet for a moment, processing something he doesn't say aloud yet. The brand on this horse's shoulder, he says finally, careful with each word. You said you didn't know what it was. I said I don't know what it is now, Lorelei says. That's not quite the same thing as never having known. She does not offer more than that, and Kaylin, to his credit, does not push. But something has shifted between them in the exchange, an understanding that they are both circling a piece of information neither is ready to name aloud, and that whatever it turns out to be, it is going to matter more than either of them is currently prepared to admit. That evening, after Kaylin's truck disappears down the drive, Lorelei goes into the house and climbs the narrow stairs to the attic for the first time in longer than she can accurately remember. Dust sits thick over everything up there, undisturbed boxes stacked against the slope of the roof, her father's old ledgers among them, the leather covers cracked and soft with age. She finds the one she's looking for near the bottom of the third box, a registry book from her father's operation, pages of careful handwriting recording bloodlines, breeding dates, brand registrations for every animal that ever wore his iron. She finds the page near the back, dated the spring before everything fell apart. A gray colt, sired by her father's best stallion. Out of a mare whose bloodline traced back 3 generations to horses that won ribbons at state fairs before Lorelei was even born. The colt's registered name is written in her father's careful hand, the ink faded but still legible after all these years. Whitlock's Ember. Beside the name, a small sketch of the brand. The same curve and crossbar that Kaylin traced with 2 careful fingers on the stallion's shoulder, unaltered, undamaged, exactly as it should have looked before someone took a second iron to it and tried to burn the truth away. Lorelei sits on the attic floor for a long time after that, the ledger open in her lap, the single bare bulb overhead casting everything in a light too harsh for the moment it's illuminating. Somewhere below her, in the barn, the horse that carried her father's brand for 8 years under someone else's ownership stands quietly in his stall, eating slowly, healing slowly, carrying inside his own body a truth that is about to upend everything Cedar Ridge believes it knows about the Hendricks Ranch, about the Whitlock theft, about the banker who has spent 4 years circling this property like a man waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. She closes the ledger. She does not sleep that night either. The morning she decides to act, frost has settled thick over the pasture, turning every blade of grass white and brittle underfoot. Lorelei stands at the fence line with her breath fogging in front of her, watching Sombra move at a slow, testing walk across the paddock, weight bearing evenly now on hooves that have finally started to grow out clean beneath the cracks. He has filled out in the weeks since the auction, not fully, not yet, but enough that a person looking at him now sees something closer to what he must have been before neglect stripped it away. There is a particular set to his neck when he lifts his head toward the wind, a carriage that speaks of bloodlines bred for show rings rather than the kind of rough handling that put those cracks in his hooves in the first place. She has spent 3 days deciding what to do with what she found in that ledger, turning the decision over the way a person turns over a stone looking for the safest place to set their foot. She could take it to the sheriff, though the sheriff in this county has always been closer to Lawson than to justice, elected twice now on money that traces back, if a person looked closely enough, to the same bank accounts that hold her mortgage. She could take it to a lawyer, though lawyers cost money she does not have, and proving an 8-year-old theft with nothing but a faded ledger entry and a badly altered brand feels, in the cold light of morning, like a fight she is not equipped to win alone. What she has instead is Kaylin, and the particular authority that comes with a veterinary license and a professional obligation to report irregularities discovered in the course of an official examination. She calls him that afternoon, and he arrives within the hour, his truck rattling up the drive with an urgency that tells her he understood something serious in the tone of her voice even before she explained why. She shows him the ledger in the kitchen, the two of them standing over the open pages at a table that has held 4 years of unpaid bills and very few visitors. Kalen studies the sketch of the brand for a long moment, then pulls his phone from his pocket and scrolls to a photograph he took during his last examination. The scarring on the Stallion's shoulder captured under a raking light that makes the warped lines easier to trace. He holds the two side by side, the drawing and the photograph, and something in his expression settles into certainty. This is the same brand, he says. Somebody tried to alter it, but the base shape underneath matches exactly. Whoever did this wasn't trying to hide that it was branded. They were trying to hide whose brand it originally was. That's my father's brand, Lorelei says. That's my father's horse. Went missing 8 years ago in a theft that broke what was left of his operation and, not too long after, broke him. Kalen sets the phone down slowly. If this horse disappeared 8 years ago and turns up now with an altered brand, he says, choosing his words with the care of someone who understands the weight they're about to carry, that's not just theft anymore. That's evidence somebody's been hiding an animal, possibly illegally, for the better part of a decade. And if the bank has taken a sudden interest in claiming this horse as debt collateral, that raises questions about how they knew to be interested in the first place. Neither of them says Lawson's name, but it sits in the room between them regardless, heavy and obvious. I work under a county contract, Kalen says after a moment, and something uncertain moves behind his eyes now, a hesitation that wasn't there a moment ago. Lawson sits on the council committee that renews that contract every year. If I file a report on this, an official one, tied to my professional findings, there's a real chance it costs me the job. Maybe more than the job, depending on how far he's willing to push back. Lorelei closes the ledger, the sound of the leather cover meeting itself unexpectedly loud in the quiet kitchen. I'm not going to pretend that's not a real risk, she says. I've spent 4 years watching what he does to people who get in his way. I won't ask you to carry that if you're not willing to. Kalen is quiet for a long moment, looking not at her, but at the phone still resting on the table, the photograph of the scarred brand still visible on the screen. My father lost his shop to a bank like this one. He says finally, quiet, the kind of admission that costs something to make. Different county, different bank, same kind of man behind the desk. I watched what that did to him. I didn't do anything about it because I was 14 and didn't understand yet what was happening until it was over. He looks up at her. I understand it now, he says. The days that follow move faster than the weeks before them. The slow rhythm of quiet recovery replaced by something with sharper edges. Kalen begins compiling his report carefully, photographing every angle of the brand under different lighting, documenting the Stallion's overall condition, cross-referencing dates and details against county auction records that show the animal was consigned by a seller whose name, when Lorelei finally tracks it down through a contact at the county clerk's office, traces back through 2 shell transactions to a holding company registered under an address she recognizes immediately, because it is the same address printed on every foreclosure notice the bank has mailed her for the last 4 years. The paperwork is not clean. It is not the kind of evidence that resolves a case with a single dramatic reveal. It is instead the kind of evidence that builds slowly, one document at a time, each piece insufficient alone but damning together, the way most real truths tend to surface rather than the way stories usually promise they will. Lawson does not wait for the paperwork to finish assembling itself before he acts. He comes back to the ranch on a Thursday morning, and this time he brings paper of his own, a folder thick with documents he sets on the hood of his truck rather than handing to her directly, forcing her to walk toward him if she wants to see what's inside. Formal notice, he says, tapping the folder. The bank is exercising its right to claim the animal currently in your possession as collateral against outstanding debt on this property. You have until end of day tomorrow to surrender him voluntarily. After that, we proceed through the sheriff's office, and I promise you, Lorelei, that process will not be gentle. Lorelei does not open the folder. She has learned, over 4 years of dealing with this man, that the paper he hands her is never as solid as he presents it, that half the leverage he wields comes from people believing his confidence rather than reading his fine print. You don't own that horse, she says. You never did. And I think you know exactly why, because I think you're the one who put a second iron to his shoulder 8 years ago and tried to burn my father's name off him. For the first time since she has known him, something in Lawson's composure cracks, just slightly, just long enough for her to see it before he smooths it back over. That's a serious accusation to make without proof, he says, his voice carrying an edge now that wasn't there a moment ago. I have proof, she says, which is not entirely true yet. Not fully. Not in a form a court would accept without more work behind it. But she watches the words land on him regardless, watches something calculate rapidly behind his eyes, and understands in that moment that she has struck closer to true than she expected to. Lawson picks the folder back up off the truck hood, his movements sharper now, less composed. You have 30 days on your mortgage before this property goes to judicial auction regardless of what happens with the horse, he says. I'd think very carefully about which fight you actually have the resources to win. He climbs into his truck and pulls away without waiting for a response. Gravel spitting from beneath his tires in a way that betrays more agitation than his voice let on, and Lorelei stands in the yard long after he's gone, watching the dust settle, understanding with a cold clarity that the deadline he just gave her is no longer just about a horse. It is about everything. That night, Lorelei sits at her kitchen table with the mortgage documents spread in front of her, the numbers unchanged from every time she has looked at them before, but somehow heavier now, pressing down with a weight that has nothing to do with arithmetic and everything to do with what she stands to lose if she does not find a way through the next 30 days. The offer sits underneath all of it, unspoken but present, the same offer Lawson has been circling toward since the day of the auction. Surrender the horse. Let the debt against the animal offset a portion of what she owes. Walk away from the fight with a smaller house somewhere in town. A life reduced but survivable. The whispers about the Hendricks Ranch finally allowed to fade because there will be nothing left of the ranch for anyone to whisper about. She could do it. She turns the thought over slowly. Honestly, the way she has forced herself to look honestly at very few things since Wendell died. Handing Sombra over would not undo the theft that happened 8 years ago, would not restore her father's name or her family's ruined operation, but it would end this particular fight, would let her keep something rather than risk losing everything on a case that might not hold up even with Kalen's report behind it. She thinks of her father in the last 2 years of his life, the way the theft hollowed something out of him that never filled back in, the way he stopped talking about the ranch entirely in the months before he died, as though the silence were easier to carry than the grief of what had been taken. She thinks of Wendell, of the years they spent trying to keep this place afloat together, of the particular guilt she has carried since the afternoon she found him in the north pasture, already gone, already past the point where 5 more minutes of her attention might have mattered. She thinks of how much of her life has already been defined by arriving too late to save something that mattered. She is not going to arrive too late this time. She finds Kalen's number and calls him past 10 at night, an hour rude enough that she almost hangs up before he answers, but he picks up on the second ring, alert, like a man who has also been sitting awake with his own version of this same decision. I'm not giving him up, she says, without preamble, without explaining who she means, because there is only one horse either of them has been thinking about for weeks now. I didn't think you would, Kalen says. Finish the report, she says. Whatever it costs you. I'll take the 30 days and I'll take the risk, but I'm not handing that horse to the man who stole him in the first place just because it would be easier. There is a pause on the line, and when Kalen speaks again, something in his voice carries a weight that tells her the decision on his end has already been made too, has perhaps been made for longer than he's admitted. I filed it this afternoon, he says, before you called. Sent it to the State Agricultural Board along with copies to the county clerk. Figured if I was going to do it, doing it fast mattered more than doing it cautious. Lorelei closes her eyes, the phone pressed hard against her ear, something in her chest loosening for the first time in weeks even as the fear underneath it sharpens. Then it's done, she says. It started, Kalen corrects, gently. Different thing. Doesn't mean it's over yet. She understands what he means before he finishes saying it. Filing the report was the first move, not the last. And whatever comes next is going to test both of them in ways the last several weeks have only begun to hint at. The response comes faster than either of them expects, though not in the form either of them anticipated. 2 days after Kalen's report reaches the State Agricultural Board, a car neither of them recognizes turns up the gravel drive, and the woman who steps out of it introduces herself as an investigator with the board's livestock fraud division, a woman named Denise Okafor whose manner is brisk and unimpressed by everything, including the cold, including the mud, including the particular tension radiating off both Lorelai and Kaylin as they lead her toward the barn. She examines the stallion herself, cross-referencing Kaylin's photographs against the animal directly, taking her own measurements, her own images, asking questions in a clipped, procedural tone that gives away nothing about what she's thinking. She asks to see the ledger. She photographs each page. She asks about the auction, about the seller, about the shell company whose address matches the bank's foreclosure notices. Writing everything down in a notebook, she keeps close against her body as though protecting it from wind that isn't blowing. This is a strong case, she says finally, closing the notebook, but strong doesn't mean simple. Registered brand fraud combined with concealment of stolen livestock is a serious charge, but proving intent, proving who altered that brand and when, that's going to take more than what we have right now. I'll need statements. I'll need to trace ownership records further back than a shell company address. This could take months. I don't have months, Lorelai says. I have 30 days before my house goes to auction. Denise looks at her for a long moment, something almost sympathetic passing behind her professional composure. Then I'd suggest you find a lawyer who can file an emergency injunction against the foreclosure timeline, citing this active fraud investigation as grounds for delay, she says. It's not a guarantee, but it's something. Judges don't love foreclosing on a property that's currently the subject of a criminal referral involving the same parties. She leaves them with a card and a promise to follow up within the week. And after her car disappears down the drive, Lorelai and Kaylin stand in the cold yard together, the weight of 30 days pressing harder now that it has a shape, a strategy, a fragile thread of hope running through it that neither of them entirely trusts yet. I don't have money for a lawyer, Lorelai says, quiet, admitting a truth she has spent 4 years trying not to say out loud to anyone. Kaylin is quiet for a moment, and then he says something that surprises her. I might know someone who owes me a favor, he says. Vet school roommate. Went into agricultural law instead of clinical practice. Might not cost what you're expecting. She does not ask why a man she has known for a few short weeks is willing to spend his own favors on her behalf. She suspects she already knows part of the answer, has seen it in the careful way he handles the stallion, in the quiet fury that crossed his face when Lawson's name first came up between them, in the particular loyalty of someone who watched his own father lose everything to a man just like this one. Thank you, she says, and the words carry more weight than their length suggests, because gratitude has become a rare enough thing in her life that offering it honestly feels almost unfamiliar. The lawyer, a sharp, tired-eyed woman named Priya Anand, files the emergency injunction 3 days later, citing the active fraud investigation as grounds to delay the foreclosure auction pending its resolution. The filing buys time, not certainty, a distinction Priya is careful to explain during a phone call that leaves Lorelai simultaneously relieved and exhausted in a way that has become the emotional baseline of the last several weeks. The judge grants a 60-day stay, not the resolution either of them hoped for, but enough breathing room to let the investigation move forward without the added pressure of an imminent auction hanging over every hour. Lawson does not take the delay quietly. He shows up twice more in the following 2 weeks, each visit shorter and colder than the last, his composure fraying visibly at the edges in a way that tells Lorelai the pressure he's under from whatever consortium sits behind him has started to match the pressure he's been applying to her. On the second visit, he does not bother with the pretense of civility at all. You have no idea what you've started, he says, standing in her yard with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets against a wind that has turned genuinely bitter now that November has settled fully over the county. There are people involved in this who are considerably less patient than I am. People who had plans for this valley that didn't account for a widow and a half-dead horse derailing a deal worth considerably more than your entire property. The land consortium, Lorelai says, watching something confirm itself behind his eyes even though he doesn't answer directly. That's what this was always about, wasn't it? Not just my mortgage. The whole valley. Lawson doesn't confirm it outright, but his silence does the work of confirmation regardless, and something in his expression, just for a moment, looks less like calculation and more like a man realizing the scope of what he's about to lose control of. I'd think very carefully, he says finally, about how far you want to push people who have considerably more resources than you do. He leaves without waiting for a response, and this time, watching his truck disappear down the drive, Lorelei does not feel the same cold fear she felt after his first visit. What she feels instead, standing in the yard with the wind cutting through her coat, and Sombra watching from the barn door with ears pricked toward the sound of the departing engine, is something closer to resolve. The investigation stretches through November and into the first bitter weeks of December, and the toll it takes shows in ways both visible and quiet. Lorelei loses the last of her credit at the feed store in town, the owner citing vague concerns about her account status that everyone understands, without saying so directly, trace back to pressure applied from the bank. She drives 40 minutes each way now for supplies, the extra gas and expense she can barely absorb. But the alternative, watching her name become a liability even for people who have known her family for decades, cuts deeper than the cost of the fuel. The town's judgment sharpens rather than softens as the investigation becomes common knowledge. Some see her as a woman finally standing up for something after years of quiet withdrawal following Wendell's death. Others see her as reckless, chasing a lawsuit she can't afford to fight, risking her home over an animal that most of them still believe isn't worth what she paid for him. She hears both versions in fragments, at the grocery store, at the post office, in the particular way certain neighbors now cross the street rather than stop to talk. Kaylin's situation deteriorates faster and more visibly than hers does. The county council, at Lawson's evident urging, opens a review of his contract barely 2 weeks after his report reaches the state board, citing vague concerns about professional conduct that everyone involved understands to be retaliation dressed up as procedure. He tells Lorelei about it over coffee in her kitchen one evening, his voice carefully level in the way of someone trying very hard not to let fear show through it. "They can't fire me outright for filing an accurate report," he says, turning his mug slowly between his hands without drinking from it. "But they can make my contract renewal difficult enough that I end up leaving on my own. Happens all the time. Nobody has to make an obvious move if they're patient enough to let pressure do the work instead." "Are you regretting it?" Lorelei asks, and the question costs her something to ask honestly, because some part of her has been afraid of this exact answer since the night she called him past 10 to ask him to finish the report. Kaylin is quiet for a long moment, looking down into his coffee rather than at her. "No," he says finally, and something in the flatness of the word carries more conviction than a longer answer would have. "My father spent the last years of his life regretting that he didn't fight when it might have mattered. I watched what that did to him. I'm not doing the same thing just because it's easier." Lorelei does not have a response ready for that, and for a while neither of them says anything else, the silence between them carrying weight rather than distance, the particular kind of quiet that exists between two people who have each decided, separately and for their own reasons, to risk something they cannot easily afford to lose. Outside, in the barn, Sombra shifts in his stall, the sound carrying faint through the cold night air, a reminder of exactly what all of this has been building toward, and exactly how much further there still is left to go before either of them finds out whether the risk was worth what it's costing. The breakthrough, when it comes, arrives from a direction neither of them anticipated. Denise Okafor calls on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December, her voice carrying an edge of restrained urgency that Lorelei has not heard from her in any of their previous conversations. She asks Lorelei and Kaylin to meet her at the State Agricultural Board's regional office the following morning, refusing to explain further over the phone, citing only that the investigation has produced something that changes the shape of the case considerably. The office, when they arrive, is smaller and more cluttered than either of them expected, a converted storefront with filing cabinets lining every wall and a single overworked space heater struggling against the December cold. Denise meets them at the door and leads them back to a conference room where a laptop sits open on the table, a technician from the state's forensic veterinary lab already seated beside it. "We had the Stallion's old identification records pulled from the National Equine Registry database," Denise says, without preamble, gesturing for them to sit. Standard practice for a fraud case like this, cross-referencing physical characteristics against any historical microchip registrations tied to horses matching his description and approximate age. The technician turns the laptop screen toward them, revealing an image of a small electronic scanner reading beside a diagram of a horse's neck, the standard location for identification microchips implanted under the skin. Registered saddlebreds from operations like your father's typically carried both a hot brand and a subcutaneous chip back in that period, Denise continues. The brand's obviously been tampered with, but nobody thought to check whether the chip was ever removed, because most people assume if you're hiding a stolen horse, you deal with both markers at once. Lorelei's chest tightens. And they didn't, she says, not quite a question. We scanned him during the initial examination, the technician says, tapping a key that brings up a new screen, a string of registration data pulled from a national database. Found an active chip. Whoever handled this animal over the last 8 years either didn't know it was there or didn't have the equipment to remove it safely. Chip confirms registration under Whitlock Ridge Stud. Original owner listed as Silas Whitlock. Registered name Whitlock's. Fold the spring indicated in your ledger. The room goes quiet for a moment, the weight of confirmation settling over all of them differently. Lorelei feeling something in her chest that is neither triumph nor relief, but something closer to a decade of grief, finally, finding somewhere solid to stand. That's not all, Denise says, and something in her tone shifts, sharper now, more focused. The chip's registration history includes an ownership transfer logged 8 years ago, filed properly through the registry, which is unusual for an animal that was supposedly stolen. Somebody with legitimate access to Silas Whitlock's registry credentials processed that transfer. We pulled the login records from the registry system. The transfer was authorized using credentials belonging to a cosigner on Whitlock Ridge Stud's original bank financing. Lorelei already knows the name before Denise says it, has known it, on some level, since the moment Lawson first stood in her yard demanding the horse be surrendered, but hearing it confirmed out loud still lands with the force of a door slamming somewhere deep in her chest. Lawson Whitfield, Denise says, listed as a secondary account holder on your father's original loan documents. Apparently a condition of financing your father agreed to back when Lawson's own career at the bank was just getting started. That access apparently never got fully revoked after the loan matured. He used it to falsify an ownership transfer 8 years ago, the same year your father's herd disappeared. Kaylin exhales slowly beside her, and Lorelei realizes she has been holding her own breath without noticing. This is enough, isn't it? Lorelei says, her voice quieter than she intends it to be. This is enough to prove what happened. Denise closes the laptop gently, her expression carrying the particular caution of someone who has learned not to promise outcomes before they're certain. It's enough to file formal charges, she says. Registry fraud, theft of livestock, falsification of financial documents tied to your father's original loan, and depending on how deep this goes, possible fraud connected to the current foreclosure proceedings against your property, since we now have reason to believe the debts used to justify that foreclosure may themselves be built on falsified records dating back to this same period. She looks between them, something almost gentle entering her voice for the first time since they arrived. It's not over, she says. There'll be a trial, depositions, more waiting than either of you is going to want to sit through. But this is the piece that turns a difficult case into a strong one. I wanted you both to hear it from me directly, before it becomes public record and this whole county finds out at once. The news breaks across Cedar Ridge the way flood water breaks across a low field, slow at first, then all at once, impossible to contain once it starts moving. Formal charges against Lawson Whitfield are filed the week before Christmas, and within days the story has consumed every conversation from the diner counter to the pews of the Sunday service. The particular details of registry fraud and falsified loan documents spreading through the town with a speed that makes the earlier rumors about Lorelei's negligence look almost gentle by comparison. The bank places Lawson on administrative leave within 48 hours of the charges becoming public, a move that fools no one into believing it reflects anything other than the institution protecting itself rather than standing behind him. The land consortium he had been quietly courting on the valley's behalf withdraws its interest entirely within the week, unwilling to attach its name to a deal now tangled in an active criminal investigation. Whatever plans existed to reshape Cedar Ridge's valley into something built for people who had never lived there dissolve almost as quickly as they had gathered momentum in the first place. Lorelei does not feel the triumph she might have expected to feel. She feels, mostly, exhausted, the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent months carrying a weight so total that setting even part of it down leaves her unsteady rather than relieved. She spends the week before Christmas doing the only thing that has ever reliably settled her since Wendell died, working the barn, tending Sombra, watching him move now with a strength and courage that seemed to grow more evident with each passing day, as though healing had been waiting all along for the truth around him to catch up to what his body already knew. The foreclosure proceedings against her property are formally dismissed in the second week of January, the judge citing the fraudulent origins of the debt now established through the ongoing criminal case against Lawson. Priya calls with the news on a gray Tuesday afternoon, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a lawyer who has watched a difficult case resolve in her client's favor, and Lorelei sits at her kitchen table afterward for a long time, the phone still in her hand, looking out the window toward the barn where a stallion that should have died in an auction ring 3 months ago now stands strong enough to canter the length of the paddock without faltering. The town's judgment does not disappear entirely, because towns rarely let go of a story once they have decided how to tell it, but something in the tenor shifts nonetheless. The whispers about negligence, about a widow letting her husband's ranch fall to ruin, thin considerably once the truth of what actually happened to her father's operation, and by extension to her family's fortunes, becomes public record rather than rumor. Some people in Cedar Ridge apologize outright, awkward and overdue. Most simply stop repeating what they used to say, which is, Lorelei has learned, sometimes the closest thing to an apology a small town is capable of offering. Kalen's contract renewal, once the subject of quiet council maneuvering meant to push him out, is approved unanimously in February. The same council members who had raised vague concerns about his conduct now unwilling to be seen distancing themselves from the veterinarian whose report ultimately uncovered a fraud scheme most of them had unknowingly enabled through years of looking the other way. He stops by the ranch more often than his professional obligations strictly require, a pattern neither of them names directly, but which has become, over the winter, simply part of the shape of Lorelei's days. She finds him in the barn on a cold February afternoon, running his hands over Sombra's now solid frame with the satisfied attention of a man checking work he's proud of, and something in the easy quiet between them, the particular comfort of two people who have weathered something difficult together and come out the other side of it still standing, settles into her chest with a warmth she has not let herself feel in a very long time. He's going to need real training soon, Kalen says, not looking at her, focused instead on running his palm down the stallion's foreleg, checking the strength of a hoof that has grown out clean and whole in the months since the auction. Bloodline like this, conformation like this, once he's fully conditioned, he could stand at stud again, could rebuild something from him, if he wanted to. Whitlock Ridge stud, Lorelei says, testing the words out loud for the first time in 8 years, and something in the sound of them, spoken in her own barn, on her own land, with her father's brand finally restored to its rightful meaning rather than hidden under someone else's lie, settles a piece of grief she has carried since long before Wendell ever died. You've got the land for it, Kalen says, straightening, meeting her eyes now. And you've clearly got the patience. She almost laughs at that, the first easy laugh she can remember offering in longer than she wants to admit. Patience, she says. Is that what we're calling nearly losing everything twice in one winter? Kalen's mouth curves, something warm and careful in it. Some people call it stubbornness, he says. I've started calling it something closer to faith. She doesn't answer that directly, but she doesn't look away from him either, and the silence that follows carries a different weight than the silences that filled this barn back in October. Back when she sat on an overturned bucket through the night listening to a dying horse's ragged breathing, uncertain whether morning would bring recovery or loss. This silence carries something closer to possibility, fragile and unfamiliar after 4 years spent believing possibility was a thing that happened to other people. Lawson's trial does not conclude until late spring, the proceedings dragging through months of depositions and evidentiary hearings that keep Lorelei's name in the county paper with a regularity she has stopped being able to ignore. She testifies twice, once regarding the auction and the horse's condition, once regarding the ledger and her father's original registration records, and each time she sits in the witness chair, she feels the particular vertigo of speaking a truth she carried alone for so long into a room finally willing to listen. The verdict, when it comes, is not the clean, total justice that closes a story the way a person might wish it could close. Lawson is convicted on the registry fraud and falsified loan documents, sentenced to restitution and several years probation rather than the prison time some in the county had hoped for, the judge citing his lack of prior record and the complexity of proving intent across 8 years of carefully layered paper trails. He loses his position at the bank permanently, his name attached now to a scandal significant enough that Cedar Ridge is unlikely to ever fully forget it, but he does not lose everything. Not the way Lorelai came close to losing everything. And there is a particular bitterness in that asymmetry that she does not pretend away, even in victory. She sits with that unfairness for a long while after the verdict, turning it over the way she has turned over every hard truth of the last several months, and eventually settles into something less than satisfaction, but more than resignation, an understanding that justice, even when it arrives, rarely arrives whole, that the best a person can sometimes hope for is enough of it to keep living the life the injustice tried to take. Her father's name is restored in the county's registry records that same spring. Whitlock Ridge stud reinstated as the rightful bloodline origin for the stallion now standing, fully recovered, in Lorelai's paddock each morning, his coat filled out to a rich dapple gray that finally does justice to the animal her father once bred him to become. She stands at the fence some mornings just watching him move, the particular carriage of a horse bred for excellence finally allowed to express itself after 8 years of neglect and secrecy, and feels something in her chest that she has not let herself feel fully since the afternoon she found Wendell in the north pasture, a grief that does not disappear, but that finally, for the first time in years, has room to breathe alongside something other than guilt. The following autumn, almost exactly a year after the morning Sombra collapsed in the mud of an auction ring nobody expected him to survive, Lorelai stands at the same fence line, watching him move across the paddock at a canter that carries no trace of the animal who once could barely stand. The house behind her still carries its slight lean. The shingles on the north side still need replacing, and the ranch has not transformed overnight into the operation her father once ran, because some kinds of restoration take longer than a single season, longer perhaps than she has years left to see fully realized. But the barn holds 2 horses now instead of 1, a young mare purchased with the first proceeds from Sombra's initial stud fees, the beginning, however small, of something her father spent his whole life building and lost in a single theft that took 8 years to finally come undone. Kalen's truck sits in the drive more often than not these days, his visits long past requiring any professional justification, and the particular ease that has grown between them over the seasons carries a warmth Lorelai does not examine too closely, content for now simply to let it exist without demanding it explain itself. The town still talks, because towns always do, but the shape of the talk has changed entirely from what it was a year ago. The whispers about negligence replaced by something closer to respect, grudging in places, genuine in others, offered by people who watched a woman nearly lose everything defending an animal the whole county once agreed was worthless. She does not think of herself as vindicated, exactly. Vindication implies an ending, a closed door, and grief does not work that way, does not simply resolve because the truth finally arrived and the villain finally answered for what he'd done. She still carries the guilt of the afternoon she arrived too late in the north pasture. She still carries the memory of her father's hollowed final years, of watching a man who loved his herd more than almost anything spend his last days believing that love had cost him everything. Those things do not disappear simply because a stallion survived an auction ring and carried the truth home on his shoulder. But standing at the fence in the low autumn light, watching Sombra move the way he was always meant to move, she understands something she could not have named a year ago, back when she climbed that rail without deciding to, back when a dying horse in the mud mattered more to her than the last of her savings. Some kinds of care do not ask to be justified by outcome. Some kinds of dignity survive being discarded, survive being sold for less than nothing, survive years of silence and neglect, waiting only for someone willing to kneel down in the mud and look closely enough to see what was never actually lost. Only hidden, only waiting. The wind moves through the paddock, carrying the first cold edge of the coming winter, and Sombra lifts his head toward it, ears pricked. The same instinct for alertness that once looked like fear now settled into something closer to simple attention, an animal finally allowed to exist without needing to brace against whatever comes next. Lorelai stays at the fence a while longer, watching him, before she turns back toward the house, toward the kitchen table where Kalen is waiting with coffee and the particular unhurried patience of a life no longer defined entirely by what it has survived. Some debts, it turns out, were never really about money at all.